Hi, my name's Ben Hales, and let me extend a warm welcome to the first main video in this series. If you've made it here, you should already have watched the introduction video on how to use this series. If you haven't absorbed that yet, it doesn't take long and I highly recommend you see it first. In this video, I'm going to introduce you to a blueprint for preflop decision making. This is a relaxed start where the main aim is for you to learn the order of the preflop elements tops, app, god, h. We'll also start thinking about each element and the first part of the questioning drills. But if you're concerned it's not sinking in, don't worry, as in the following two videos, I'm going to go through the same information but in more depth. You can also stop, pause, rewind and rewatch at any time. Tops, app, god, h will no doubt sound ridiculous to you right now. It's an odd choice of title for a video, but the reason for it is that tops, app, god, h is our framework for preflop thought processes. If you can remember nothing else at the end of this, I want you to remember tops, app, god, h and test yourself on what each letter stands for. Within the realm of preflop thinking, there are two main stages. There's the bit we do before the cards are dealt and the bit we do after the cards are dealt. Both are about gathering and processing information. Before the cards are dealt, there are a lot of general things to think about, and the specific order in which you tackle them doesn't matter that much. There's flexibility in whether you want to consider stack sizes before opponents or vice versa. So if you have a strong desire to change the order I outline, feel free to do so. After the cards are dealt, the information we gather gets more and more specific, and the order in which we handle each element is much more rigid. Please ensure you follow the sequence. On the left hand side, you can see that there are 4 elements to be considered before the deal, or 3 for cash game players. And on the right hand side, there are 6 elements to be considered after the deal. On the screen here is the information I want you to learn today. The first 4 will be straightforward for most of you: tournament situation, opponents, position and stack sizes. The second 6 will present more challenges, but for now just focus on what each letter stands for: action, pot odds, game theory optimal ranges, opponents ranges, deviations and hole cards. Tops, app, god, h. This is our preflop drill that needs repeating over and over and over again. Let's now focus on each of the first 4 elements, tops. T is for tournament situation. When we're playing in a tournament, there are a few key questions to ask. These are not the only questions, but they are the key ones. We need to know, what type of tournament is this? What stage of the tournament are we at? What's the payout structure? And are there ICM implications? Now, over time, you're not going to need to remind yourself of this information in every single hand, and certainly not during every step of every hand. But whilst you're going through the learning process, I recommend including all of the questions. These are never bad questions. Well, except for if you're playing in a cash game, then granted they'd be a waste of time. For now, I'm going to press on to the next slide, but don't worry if you haven't got this memorized. We'll be coming back to it again several times. O is for opponents, and if you're playing in a cash game, this may be your starting point. Before any cards are dealt, you want to be gathering as much information on your opponents as possible. Here, I have 4 questions listed to help you extract that information. You may have other questions, I certainly do, but these 4 are a good starting point and start us thinking the right way about our opponents. First, we want to know how many players are at the table. This might not be a question you need to ask every hand, but it's vital to recognize changes from the norm. If you're a cash game player at a full ring table, the dynamics and ranges change a lot. If, for example, you'll find yourself with only 7 or even fewer players there. Of course, there's lots more to delve into, and in practice, you're going to be diving deeper and deeper into a tree of questions about opponents' tendencies, and you can use the time between hands to update your profiles of the different villains. The questions you ask about opponents aren't always going to be the ones listed, but these are good starting points for assessing the table as a whole. The third question is just a general prompt. What else do I know about these players? You can word this however you want. Live players are going to gather all sorts of information from things like table talk and body language. Whatever type of poker game you're playing, always remain active in your gathering of information on opponents. It's really easy to switch off, so questioning drills are a vital tool to keep you engaged. The final question here asks specifically what levels of thinking are opponents on. I find this really important as it can prevent me from overthinking or making fancy plays against players who aren't thinking much beyond the cards they have. I will talk about this more in the next video. P is for position. I recommend considering position after opponents, but you can combine them together or find a way that works for you. There's less work to do here. You simply need to observe the positions of each player on the table as part of the routine you go through in each hand before the cards are dealt. For some of you, you might prefer to think just about your own position and only focus on your opponent's positions if it becomes relevant later in the hand. That's okay, but I encourage you to do preemptive thinking wherever possible. There are many benefits to thinking at least one move ahead. Whenever you play turn-based strategy games, it's useful to have a clear vision of who is sat in each position of the table before the action begins. For some of these straightforward questions like, what's my position? There's a temptation to ignore them as the answers are so simple. Remember, we're not asking these questions as a test, we're asking them to keep us thinking actively and to prevent our brains from taking shortcuts. If you do this, you will never be that player who is describing a poker hand but can't recall his position. S is for stacks. For tournament players in particular, this is a very important pre-flop consideration. And when I presented this information to my test group, a few of the tournament players preferred to group stack sizes with tournament situation. This is the order of these questioning drills before the cards are dealt. So tops could be stop or T-sop depending on your preference. Whenever we allow ourselves to go into a lot of detail in our thoughts, we will tend to start combining information. So we won't think of an opponent without thinking of his stack size, tournament situation, and position. That crossover is absolutely okay, but be smart with how much time you're spending on each element. Remember, what we're doing before the cards are dealt is gathering general information about the entire table. We want to avoid doing too much in-depth thinking about any one specific opponent. If you find yourself thinking too much about one opponent, try and shift your focus back to the rest of the table. So when we're thinking about stacks, we're getting a general snapshot of each player's stack size, paying particular attention to big stacks and small stacks. This is more relevant, of course, to tournament play, but cash game play should also be on the lookout for short stackers. Knowing your own stack size at the start of each hand is essential. So if you're short on time, at the very, very least, ensure you know this information. The first part should be sinking in slowly. If you can remember what TOPS stands for, you're doing well. Now let's turn our attention to the 6 remaining letters, APGOD-H. Remember, TOPS, APGOD-H. This section is more rigid in the way you should approach it. I'm not saying you shouldn't tweak it, but you do need to respect the importance of the order APGOD-H. A is for action, as in the action that takes place in front of you before your decision. Whenever you're sat under the gun, you can skip this entirely, at least for the first round of preflop action. Not long ago, I was imploring you to respect the really simple questions, the ones with obvious answers. This is one of those questions. Of course, everyone thinks about the action subliminally. But what I'm asking you to do is to think actively about it. That means you need to ask this simple question or commentate through the action in your mind. If you're playing online, by the way, you can commentate out loud. It's a fantastic way of staying focused and thinking actively. By stating the action in front of you, you are less likely to make mistakes, and it will help you with important numbers such as bet sizes, pot sizes, and stack sizes. It leads in nicely to the consideration of pot odds, which is coming up next. P is for pot odds, and yes, this involves doing some mathematical calculation. If you're one of those people who shies away from doing the maths, here's an opportunity to fix that leak. If you're someone who understands pot odds but rarely calculates them at the table, here's an opportunity to fix that leak. For many of you, this will be the first major challenge. You might first want to focus on your hand and your opponents, but I am asking you to work out your pot odds first. Why am I asking this? Your pot odds are a vital part of every poker decision. They give you a sense of how often you need to be able to win to justify an investment. You must not start building ranges for raising, folding, or calling without first understanding this risk-reward ratio. Once you're accustomed to calculating pot odds, it's extremely easy and fast. For those of you who struggle with it, you'd be surprised how quickly you can master it if you simply apply yourself and practice it during each and every decision. Over time, you can reintroduce an element of shortcutting this, but not until you've made it a habit, and not until you're at a point where you really understand the influence of pot odds on your ranges. In the third video, I will take you through the process of calculating pot odds, but for now, let's keep the focus on TOPS, APGOD-H. G is for GTO ranges. I'll be honest, this is really hard. But just because it's hard, that doesn't mean we should give up. G does not stand for give up. It stands for game theory optimal. What we want to do is assign ranges that are optimal for any active opponents and ourselves. So if we're facing a raiser, we would start by assigning a range which we consider optimal for that player in that position. We're not assigning the range we think that specific villain is actually raising with. We're assigning the range which we believe is perfect play. Now, when we're dealing with preflop ranges, most of us will have a fairly accurate idea of what a perfect opening range is from various positions. If you've ever studied an opening range chart, these are close to optimal, though often slightly tight. Similarly, if you're considering 3-betting or calling from the big blind, you'll have faced this type of spot many times before, so you ought to have a rough concept of what your optimal ranges look like. So for your first decision at least pre-flop, assigning GTO ranges ought not to be so difficult. If the action comes back around to you and you have to think about your next optimal response, That can be much more challenging. The post-flop will be even more difficult still, but we'll get to that in due course. For now, you can see that we have 4 questions to help lead us. They will only help us so much. You will need to do plenty of study too, and you can expect to get lost plenty of times. Don't seek perfection with GTO ranges. Do your best. O is for opponents' ranges. Having considered the optimal ranges for our opponents and ourselves, we now put them to one side and think about our specific villain. Is he tight? Is he loose? What would he raise with here? If you're not sure, you can skip this part and stick with an optimal range. If there's more than one opponent, don't forget to go through the process for each of them. Assigning opponent-specific ranges is a difficult task, but it's an important one. Don't give up on it just because it's hard. Keep practicing. Get comfortable being wrong frequently and continue to hone your skills. This is something you will improve at over time. D is for deviations. We've already considered what our optimal ranges look like, but now we may want to make adjustments in order to exploit our opponents. Again, if we're just not sure about our opponent, we can skip this and stick with the GTO ranges we assigned earlier. But if we want to play the best poker possible, we need to consider our opponents and how we can exploit them. I will go through this in more detail in the 3rd video, as well as showing you how this works in the example videos. Now, all this talk about GTO ranges, opponents ranges, deviations might be scaring some of you, especially if you're new to thinking in ranges. You are not alone. Most players are intimidated by this, and only the very best are doing it consistently well. By following the pre-flop process tops app god H, you will make all of this a habit, and over time you can be one of those players thinking in ranges consistently well. Finally, H is for hole cards. Just as Harrington recommended in his chapter Elements of a Hand from Harrington on Hold'em Part 1, I too recommend that the final element for you to consider is your hole cards. For many of you, this will be the first thing you consider. For you, this is one of the most important changes you can make to your game. Before you consider your hand, you should first be analyzing tops app god. The H comes last for good reason. If you've gone through the process properly, by the time you consider your hole cards, you'll know which range the hand fits into. You'll also know if it's at the top, middle, or bottom of that range. These are some of the things that are important for you to note as you go ahead and make your action. Your action will sometimes conclude the pre-flop action, but often it will continue. If you folded, I highly recommend you continue to follow the action and consider your opponent's ranges. You can gain valuable information about their play, especially when they reveal their cards. If you switch off and take a breather, you could miss out on that information, which could help you in a future hand. Let's assume for now that you remain involved and the action comes back around to you. Simply repeat the steps for after the cards are dealt. App god H, action, pot odds, GTO ranges, opponents ranges, deviations, and hole cards. The process remains the same, and you're going to hear me say that a few times. So well done. You made it through the opening preflop video and you learned the sequence tops app god H. My guess is you can already remember most or all of the elements, and so you're in great shape for the next 2 videos. I'll see you again in part 2.